genesis moment for Mars, and then stand back.
I hope Wilfred doesn't talk to his economic colleagues at the New York Times about this, because they'd be worried about what this would mean for the trade deficit.
And I was also, I must say, I was kind of thrilled to find that there may be water on the moon after all, or at least ice, therefore possibly water, because it means we won't have to take any there, and that possibly something of a similar process could be inaugurated up there too.
Let's get some more calls in. Bel Air, Maryland. You're next. Bel Air, go ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
My question is, or my comments are for Mr. Frum, who seemed to have some nasty things to say about the Canadian health care. I recently attended a wedding in Connecticut, and most of the guests were from Canada. And while they were there, the mother of one of the guests had fallen and broken a hip. Now, the extent of the medical care in Canada is such that this woman didn't even feel compelled to run home. There was instant medical care and home care available to her. So I'd also like to point out recently, a couple of years ago, Mr. Tsongas, ex-Senator Tsongas, made a comment that if he'd had his condition, which required bone marrow transplant, in Canada he would have died. I think he failed to mention that the procedure for bone marrow transplant was perfected in Canada. There was nobody there at that wedding. I took that occasion to bring up the state of medical care in Canada, and everybody raved about it. I would also point out to Mr. Frum that his comment about the horrors of some of the abuses in our own system are not as anecdotal as you would seem to imply. 8,000 women were sent home the same day having a mastectomy. To me, that is not a minor horror story.
Mr. Frum?
Granted, it was a small percentage of the women, but that it should happen at all. I would also bring up the drive-by delivery situation.
Well,
Caller, let's get a response.
Well, I think the drive-by delivery is sort of an unfortunate, actually, comparison, because drive-by deliveries are now the rule in Canada, that everybody in Canada, unless you have an extreme condition, is sent home within 24 hours. Also, the babies are left in the room. They close in most of the, at least in most of the Toronto hospitals. I think this is the case in the poorer parts of Canada. They've closed the incubators, except for the high-risk babies. You get the baby right away because there isn't money for nurses. I mean, it's true about Canadian medical research. I mean, there are a lot of brilliant people working in Canadian universities. But the Canadian medical situation is exactly what you would expect it to be in a society where you pay, an English-speaking society adjacent to the United States, where doctors are paid, and the more skilled they are, the more true this is, something between a third and one-half what their American counterparts are paid, in which patients, in which the only check on patients don't see a bill, so the only check on their use of the system is top-down administrative controls, and in which governments try to control costs by reducing the amount of technology in the system. It behaves exactly the way you would expect it to behave.
Lafayette, Louisiana, you're next.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, I'd like to talk to Mr. Hitchens about the national health care in Britain. I don't know how you think it's wonderful. I'll just give you one example. My sister needed surgery for a hernia. It took 2 years before they finally admitted her. And if she couldn't have gone that day when they called, she would have to go on the list again, on the waiting list. They finally did the surgery on her. She was in terrible pain. They did what they called keyhole surgery over there. After 6 hours, she was still in surgery. He had to open her up and go in. And what he did was he ruptured her spleen, and he had to take her spleen out. And now she's on antibiotics for the rest of her life. Now, if she was in this country, she would be a millionaire. And I don't believe in suing doctors. But this is just one example of the national health care in Britain. My father died because of the national health care in Britain. We all say, wonderful, the doctors come to your house. They came to the house twice in the middle of the night for my father and ignored it. And by the time the GP came in the morning after his quote, surgery hours, he was sent to the hospital, died in the ambulance with an aneurysm. So don't tell me it's wonderful the doctors have house calls. It doesn't mean a damn thing.
All right, caller. Tell us more about it.
I think I said initially that it's the only one of British Labour's post-war institutional accomplishments that even Mrs. Thatcher felt she couldn't challenge. But that doesn't mean to say that the service hasn't become extremely run down and hasn't had grave cuts inflicted on it. And I've heard, actually I can't say I've heard a story as bad as the one the lady just told us. It sounds absolutely frightful. But I've heard stories not dissimilar, and more of them recently, as the service has been allowed to fall into disrepair, but it still upholds the principle that healthcare is a right and is available to all. And that principle is imperfectly observed. Doesn't seem to me to be a criticism of what I said at the outset.
We have a call from Central South Carolina. What's on your mind?
Yes, I have a comment and a question for Chris Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens, I have heard that you are an atheist, and I was wondering if that was true, because I think you're much too intelligent to be an atheist, and you seem to have a really good heart, so I'm wondering why you don't believe in God. And I hope that you're not basing your concept of what Christianity is on the Pat Robertson model, because believe me, he does not speak for me, and I consider myself a born-again Christian, and he does and says a lot of things that are completely left field as far as I can tell. So I would encourage you to maybe look at a magazine like Sojourner. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's that model too of Christianity, and I'm wondering if you've ever considered that and how that affects your faith or lack thereof, if at all.
All right, Colin.
Well, you seem to have a good heart too, ma'am, though how you can tell about mine, I don't know. I would caution you not to judge a book by its cover. I have read Sojourners, and I've met the people who work there, and very nice they are too, but not even they will convince me that I owe my presence in this studio to a divine design. I don't believe I was divinely designed, nor do I believe I'm divinely supervised as I go about my daily tasks. I've decided that there's simply no reason to believe it, and so I don't.
I was rather looking forward to a conversion moment here on C-SPAN, where Christopher Hitchens was going to...
It's blinded by the light. No, it's just, I just think that the whole hypothesis of us being created is now, I think that's very nearly, you can't, of course, totally disprove the existence of God. You can simply say there's no reason to believe in his or her existence. I think the idea of a divinity as the creator has now pretty much been, well, rendered unnecessary as an assumption. I mean, we have alternative explanations of how we got here, but it isn't really religious to say you believe that you're created. It's much more religious to say that you owe worship to someone who is supervising you and who takes an interest in your thoughts and your daily doings. I just find that quite impossible to believe and quite unnecessary to believe, and though it doesn't have to issue in superstition and bigotry and foolishness of the Pat Robertson kind, it makes a very good nursery for that sort of thing, because it's fundamentally solipsistic and narcissistic to believe that you are the adored object of a divinity.
Let's get Mr. Frum back in. Any other articles that you saw?
I think those were the big ones of the day. What seems to happen, I often wonder whether it's the supply of news that fluctuates or whether it's journalists' appetites for it. That I wonder whether, in fact, so many of the best journalists in America don't schedule holidays for the 2 weeks or 3 weeks immediately after an election, that you notice that your newspapers become very, very thin, and they become filled with stories like, I mean, with all due respect to Sigmund Freud, the front page story in the New York Times on the Russians rediscovering Freud, that had the feel of a story that was written maybe 3 months ago, that was being saved for the day that all their political correspondents took their post-election holiday.
Would you classify this story in that category? We talked about this a little bit earlier.
No,
here.
This story is charming. This is really...
This is Dick Morris, the former aide to the president who left toward the end of the campaign there. He's pushing a book that he has out. And a picture here has him speaking to a class at NYU, New York University, in the city there. And he talks about his prescription for a comeback. 3 points. Number 1, apologize. You have to recognize your sins. Number 2, don't make excuses. And 3, consider yourself inoculated from further questions and criticism. And Susan Page writes that his comeback road is dauntingly uphill.
Well, that last sentence is much too optimistic. It isn't at all uphill. I mean, he's already back in the newspapers. No, I think he will be astonishingly easy. The essence of the Dick Morris method seems to be, don't confuse the verbal formula of an apology with actual contrition. Because If you really were sorry, you wouldn't be able to help coming back to the subject.